everybody. Thanks for being here. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Chris Wright. I run the Anti-Communism Action Team. I'm one of the co-sponsors of today's event, along with Votev Academy and Nora's nonprofit.
American Research Center in Bulgaria.
Thank you. And we have a great program for you today with Andrew Bernstein, who will be our lecturer. But first, I'll say a few words, then Nora will introduce our speaker. I wanted to tell you that the Anti-Communism Action Team has been going for 9 years. We have a website, spiderinthefly.com, with hyphens between the words, spider, hyphen, etc. We have a weekly roundup of anti-communism news, both foreign and domestic, and I invite you to sign up for that. It's a mailing list, and it's mail@spiderinthefly.com, again with hyphens between the words, and it's free, and your contact information is never sold or shared. We also have a speakers bureau. We have survivors of communism and also subject matter experts. We'll do this anywhere in the country through video conferencing. So we were on Zoom before Zoom was cool. And we're in our 9th year of doing this. We've done a number of programs. We've presented at the Leadership Institute, been and the Heritage Foundation, been at Breitbart TV and Levin TV. So I encourage you to look into all that at your leisure. And the last thing I would like to say is today is 9/11. We remember what happened 21 years ago. If you have not been to the Flight 93 Memorial in Shanksville, Pennsylvania, I highly encourage you to do it. It's well worth your time. It's about 20 miles off the turnpike. And with that, I'll turn it over to Nora. Nora?
Good afternoon, and thank you very much for attending our event today on Sunday afternoon. And it's a great honor to be able to co-organize this lecture today. And I wish to thank Votev Academy for hosting us in this beautiful library, and also the Anti-Communism Action Team for co-organizing this event. And this lecture is on a very important topic, and in a way it's symbolic that today's sad day, 9/11, is the day when we have this lecture, because 9/11 was about rejection of American values, and totalitarian socialism is the opposite of American values, and both National Socialism and communism exemplify what is the exact opposite of everything good about our country. So it is an extreme honor and pleasure to introduce Dr. Andrew Bernstein. He has a PhD in philosophy, and he teaches. He's a professor, but also he is the author of numerous very interesting and very useful books, both fiction and non-fiction. And we are very fortunate because a couple of years ago we published a historical and philosophical novel by Dr. Bernstein, our charity did, and you can get an autographed copy today after the talk. It's called The Dearth of Eagles.
Grab a copy, Laura.
And it's about communism and freedom fighters in Bulgaria, and even though the plot is fictional, it has a lot of truth and a lot of philosophical reflections, and it references a lot of historical events. Most recently, Dr. Bernstein published...
We have plenty of copies.
Yeah, so this is a great book and makes a wonderful gift also for your family, because it's like a James Bond novel, but better. And it also tells the truth about communism, so I highly recommend it. So
And it makes it's got a serious intellectual theme.
Yes, yes.
And that way it's different
Yeah.
than James Bond novels.
Yeah, and it's also, it's very fast-paced, so you'll never be bored, and it changes, the scenery changes between Manhattan and Bulgaria, and freedom fighters being chased by the secret services and whatnot, so I think you will enjoy it.
And the main character is a novelist, he's a writer, and he wants to write hero stories, and he works with these freedom fighters every day, and he's trying to convince the New York literary experts that these hero stories are serious, and they think, no, there are no people like that. And he goes, well, I work with them every day, but I can't say what their names are because they're behind the Iron Curtain and they'll be killed. So anyway, that's a big part of the plot.
So we are very, very fortunate to have Dr. Bernstein today. He came here from New York especially for this event, and he most recently published a fascinating and most useful book on education, because as you all know, American education is in dire straits and there's a lot of indoctrination going on. So he has some ideas how to fix that. So that's a book that
Yeah,
we,
this is my most recent book, Why Johnny Still Can't Read. You're probably familiar with Rudolph Flesch's famous book, Why Johnny Can't Read. There's a take, on that. Why Johnny still can't read or write or understand math and what we could do about it. It's a devastating critique of the school system. And the second half of the book is what parents can do to greatly improve the education of their children. So I don't have copies of this for sale with me, but
yeah, we
easily
will
available
have,
from
yeah,
Amazon.
We'll have an event later this year, probably here or another venue in this area, and we can do a premiere of this book.
Thank you.
So now let me give the floor to Dr. Bernstein, and after the end of the formal presentation, you're all welcome to ask questions, and we may actually have some online questions in the chat as well, and we invite you all to have an informal discussion on the nature of socialism and why it's against freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Norm. Thank you, everybody, for putting this event on, the OTEP Academy, and to Chris Wright, and to Nora Dimitrova-Clinton. It's good to be back in this area. Now, the talk is on Nazism, or National Socialism, and communism, the two forms of full socialism. So it's on politics, and I'm going to do something that's rarely done in political discourse. I'm actually going to define my terms. Well, what a concept, right? Because politics, as you know, is often filled with mushy, woozy terms. You get American politicians, this great democracy of ours, they'll say, there's not one person in 100, maybe not one in 1,000, who knows, one, what a democracy is, and two, thank God that the United States is not a democracy, right? It's a constitutional republic. So yeah, I'm going to define terms. And also, we're talking about two versions of totalitarian state, two versions of collectivist dictatorship, National Socialism, and communism. So we need to discuss the antipode also, individual rights and capitalism. But also, I just want to point out before we get started, I rarely use the term Nazism. Nazi is a contraction for National Socialist or National Socialism, and if we use the right name, the full name, it helps indicate to people that this is a form of socialism. The only good thing we could say about National Socialism is it's well named. It's accurately named. And the great Chinese philosopher Confucius said a long time ago that the beginning of wisdom is to see to it that things are called by their right names. Okay, so let's define some terms. Here, I'm well known as an objectivist intellectual. I'm a big admirer of Ayn Rand, and she defines. And everybody, if you haven't read Ayn Rand's books, I strongly recommend The Fountainhead, Atlas Shrugged, preeminently. But capitalism is the system of individual rights, including property rights, in which all property is privately owned. The key point here, as the antipode or opposite to these collectivist dictatorships, is that capitalism is the system of individual rights. To put it simply, your life belongs to you. Does not belong to the state. I mean, the right to your own life in both the moral sphere and in the economic sphere. So I think the most fundamental aspect of that right, and one that's under fire today, is freedom of speech. When we see, the administration establishing, what did they call it, a division of disinformation at the Department of Homeland Security. George Orwell in 1984 had a better name for it. He called it the Ministry of Truth. And that is terrifying, that improperly the government has no say, no business, no say in the truth-falsity business, right? None. Truth and falsity is not determined by the government. And by the way, DHS, Homeland Security, that's a law enforcement agency. So if you or I, put forth theories that they deem disinformation, does that mean federal agents with guns show up at our doors and arrest us? I mean, that's certainly the direction in which we're heading. Freedom of speech, individual rights. I think the single most important right here is freedom of speech. That's because what that means is freedom of the mind, freedom of intellectual expression. And we disagree on all kinds of issues. Let's say, climate change, as one controversial topic. Everybody puts forth their evidence, right? I I mean, I've taught logic for 40 years, and I tell my students over and over and over again, these issues are decided by evidence. Not by who says it, not by what their academic pedigree is, not by what work they've done in the past. The issue is decided by evidence, 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 and did I say evidence? And with freedom of intellectual expression, everybody is free to put forth the evidence, and then rational individuals look at the evidence and they judge what conclusion has the evidence to support it. This is the way we arrive at truth. This is the way we refute error. We don't fight falsehood with suppression. We fight falsehood with truth. Right? We don't fight irrationality with suppression. We fight irrationality with rationality. We don't fight disinformation with suppression. We fight disinformation with information. Right? So this is a hallmark of capitalism. By the way, the proper name for this system is liberalism. It's the way it's known in some parts of the world, and it's the proper name. The LIB root, liberty, the support of liberty, meaning of individual rights. So capitalism is and a lot of people don't realize it, is a Marxist name. Depending on who you read, Marx either coined the term or some earlier socialist did, but at the very least, Marx popularized it. And you can see, what does that mean? Capitalism. To Marx, that means it's the system in which the men of capital, the men of wealth, have the economic and political power to legally persecute the poor, and the working class. The essentials of Marxism, of class, inherent inveterate class warfare, is packed into the very name. It's a Marxist term. The proper name for the system of individual rights is liberalism. So the system of liberty, freedom of speech, and James Madison was, he's been canceled, right? He was a slave owner. Well, not in Virginia anymore, anyway. We're in Maryland. But James Madison was a slave owner, and we properly condemn him for that. But he also did a lot of great things in his career. Lead author of the U.S. Constitution, and virtually the sole author of the Bill of Rights. Freedom of religion, right there in the First Amendment. Most people don't even know that. My students just look at me. First of all, they don't know who James Madison was. College kids, American college kids never heard of it. Half my class never heard of James Madison. It's really sad. It's a statement. They don't teach American history much anymore, and to the extent they do, they use Howard Zinn, People's History of the United States, written by communists, literally, he's a member of the Communist Party. But First Amendment, if the students know that as the freedom of speech amendment, that's excellent. But very few people know that that's the freedom of religion. All right? The first sentence of the First Amendment states, quote, Congress shall make no laws respecting an establishment of religion, comma, or restricting the free exercise thereof. That was a revolution in 1790. It's a revolution to this day, right? I said, don't try this at home. We'll fly to Syria. We'll tell our good friends at ISIS, I'm so glad to see you guys are so intoxicated with God. You're so religious. You love God so much. That's great. Freedom of religion forever, boys, right? So, it was God is commenting on this. But I asked the students, what'll the boys at ISIS tell me when I say that? And when one kid looked at me and said, what'll ISIS say to you, Dr. Bernstein? You mean before or after they chop off your ass? Which, of course, is sadly true. Freedom of religion was not just revolutionary in 1790, it's revolutionary today. So these are some of the aspects of individual rights. Your life belongs to you. The freedom of the press, freedom of peaceful assembly, like this freedom to start your own, to earn and to own property, freedom to start your own company, to retain any profits that you make from the company, so on and so forth. All of this is an aspect of individual rights that your life belongs to you. Now, socialism, properly conceived, socialism is the system in which an individual's life is socialized. It does not belong to the individual anymore. It belongs to society. It belongs to the state. And I think that's a good way to explain socialism. Socialism is the system in which an individual's life is socialized. Your life belongs to society, not to the state. This isn't full socialism. There are all kinds of mixed economies. The United States is one. Scandinavia is another one. We'll get to that in a little while. But, and here historically and philosophically, the leading influence was the enormously influential German philosopher George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, 1770 to 1831, post-Kantian German philosopher, state worshiper. Literally, his politics is known as state worship. And I had a professor in grad school who used to say, if you really want to understand the philosopher, you got to know who his philosophic enemies are. And that's an interesting point because you need, first, foremost, and always, you need to know what a philosopher stands for, but it's helpful to know what and who the philosopher is against. And Hegel's political philosophy, of course, is directed against the Lockean, Jeffersonian tradition of individual rights, the Anglo-American system of individual rights. And Hegel is the preeminent philosopher of the Germanic approach to political philosophy. And as the state comes first, foremost, and always, the state is preeminent, and individual subordinate to the state, and an individual owes. Hegel puts it very nicely in his work on politics. If you ever read Hegel, you know, or tried to read Hegel, you know his main work, the Phenomenology of Mind, is impenetrable. It makes Kant look like Beetle Bailey by comparison. But in his work on politics, the philosophy of right, it's actually intelligible. I mean, you could understand it. And he says this, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but he says in so many words, that first of all, that individuals do not have rights. We have obligations, no rights. We have obligations to the state. The state could. This is obviously directed against Locke, and Jefferson and the Anglo-American school of political philosophy. And Hegel goes on to say in the philosophy of right, in so many words, that if the state calls upon me to surrender my life, then I am morally obligated to do so. I mean, this is like open season on individuals. Anybody that the state deems unworthy, or somebody the state deems dangerous or unworthy of life, the state has the moral right to terminate my life, your life, any individual's life. So now the prime examples of this, of course, are National Socialism, Fascist Italy, the Soviet Union, North Korea, systems like that. Full totalitarianism, which we're going to discuss, and full collectivist dictatorships, which we're going to discuss today. But again, full socialism means your life belongs to society as a whole. The state comes first. That's, if you read Hegel, the society or the state is always capitalized. I often thought that if there were no uppercase letters on Hegel's typewriter, his whole political philosophy would have collapsed. But the state is the march of God through history, he says. That's a quote. Now, I'm not sure what that means, but I know it sounds scary. The state is the march of God through history. Now, what does that mean? Does that mean in some sense that the state is divine? Yeah, I think for Hegel it does. He is literally known as a state worshiper in the history of political philosophy. Does that mean in some sense the state is infallible? Yeah, I think for Hegel it does. And so Hegel dies in 1831. He's a very popular lecturer in the German universities, University of Vienna, which is where Marx attended college, at least for a while. He's very popular, drew students from all over Deutschland. Another German philosopher at the time, Arthur Schopenhauer, according to legend, he asked the administration to schedule his lectures at another time because he didn't want to have to compete with Hegel. So it's an interesting point here. This is how the universities are how philosophy. The universities are the conduit by means of which philosophy is transmitted into the intellectual culture. Because Hegel wrote that Kant before him, these abstruse philosophic theories. But Germany is known as the land of poets and philosophers. In fact, I don't want to. I'm going to be bashing German philosophy here. So let me make. I don't want to sound like a bigot here. Germany is one of the most advanced cultures in the history of the world, and there's no denying. Right? I mean, there isn't a field of intellectual endeavor in which German intellectuals have not excelled. From architecture to zoology, A to Z, anything in between. Music, obviously. Literature, Goethe, Schiller, great writers. German engineering is even is a cliche. But German philosophy is a disaster. German philosophy is just horrendous and has been terribly destructive, in the world. And so Hegel dies 1831. Marx's dates 1818 to 1883. Marx lives right through the middle of the 19th century. German, a PhD in philosophy, goes to the University of Jena for a while, where Hegel had taught for many years, and Hegel's influence was strong. And we see Germany moving through the 19th and into the 20th century towards National Socialism and via Marx to communism. But before we get to the National Socialists and the communists, let's discuss briefly the mixed economy. Now, what the so-called mixed economy is a farrago of clashing elements. It's just a confused mixture of part individual rights and part of sacrifice to the state, part freedom, part dictatorship. And look at the examples. People, there's so much confusion in politics. You'll often hear people talk about Scandinavia as though those countries are socialist. And they'll talk about the United States as if it's capitalist. I don't know. No. They're all mixed economies. So you could look at some of the examples. They're all mixed economies. So let's take Sweden, for example, which is the largest, I think, of the Scandinavian economies. There's a great deal of individual rights in Sweden. I don't think the Swedes have a constitutional amendment, upholding freedom of speech, but there's a lot of, by permission, by privilege, there's a lot of free speech that's allowed. You're not going to get incarcerated in Sweden for criticizing the government in many cases, or standing up for individual rights and being an Iron Man supporter. There's freedom of religion. The borders are open. You don't get shot if you try to emigrate from Sweden. There's a lot of individual rights in that regard, and in the economic sphere. IKEA is privately owned and operated for profit. Volvo is privately owned and operated for profit. Saab is privately owned and operated for profit. Ericsson is privately owned and operated for profit. You walk down the streets of Stockholm, all these stores and shops, butcher, baker, candlestick maker, they're all privately owned and operated for profit. So, there's a great deal of individual rights in these Scandinavian countries. There's a good deal of, there's a massive taxation. There's a large welfare state. The state has an enormous amount of power in different areas. But full socialism, no. It's not National Socialism. It's not communism. It's a mixed economy. There's a lot of individual rights there. And the United States, the United States was largely a capitalist system 100 years ago, late 19th, turn of the 20th century. But today, no, it's almost as much of a mixed economy as the Scandinavian countries. The most egregious examples of the socialist elements in the American mixed economy is the goddamn government school system, which is an unconscionable evil, which gets students, I'm tempted to say victims, which gets its victims by force, by compulsory education, gets money by force, by taxation. It tax parents. A lot of parents, their taxes, their property tax, their income tax, their sales taxes go to finance the government school system. By the way, see to it that things are called by their right names. The euphemism is public schools. Any private school is open to the public. These are government schools. Right? See to it that things are called by their right names. They're owned, they're operated by the government, they're funded by force by the government, and close to 90% of American school kids go to the government schools, which are controlled by what Arthur Bester, American historian, wrote a book, Educational Wastelands, in the 1950s. He spoke of what he called the interlocking director. Who holds the power of the government school system? And he pointed out, one, the teachers' colleges or schools of education. Two, the state departments of education. Three, the federal department of education. This is the interlocking director. This is who holds the power in the school system, and they dictate the curriculum. And the curriculum has increasingly become, over the last 100 years, less phonics to teach reading, so more remedial reading problems, less American history. Social studies replaced history 100 years ago. Less history and more communist propaganda, especially in the form of Howard Zinn's book, and so on and so forth. And you get these college kids, and as a college professor, I inherit the products of the school system, and these are good kids. These are good American kids. But some of them struggle just with the mechanics of reading. This is college. They struggle in some cases, not all, but some cases, just with the mechanics of reading, never mind with reading comprehension. And my math colleagues, not surprisingly, tell me the same thing. We have to do remedial work with the kids in math. So it's less and less academic training, more and more propaganda. The government school system is a very good example of socialism, socialist elements in America. The welfare state, of course, is the socialization of the charity industry. The Federal Reserve System is the socialization of the money supply. The school system is the socialization of education, in this country, and so on and so forth. So the United States is not a capitalist system. It hasn't been for 100 years. It's a mixed economy. I don't know how much different it is than the Scandinavian countries at this point. Maybe we have slightly more capitalist elements than the Scandinavian countries do. Maybe they have slightly more socialist elements than we do, but it's very, very close at this point. They're all mixed economies. All right. You ready for this cheery topic of National Socialism and Communism? Yes. Well, that's the topic. So, this I'm using here. A lot of people here probably know my good friend Jonathan Honig, who's Ayn Rand had started a textbook of Americanism, and she didn't finish it. And Jonathan Honig got the rights from her student and literary executive, Dr. Leonard Peikoff, and finished this a few years ago, a new textbook of Americanism. And so I'm reading here from my essay. Not reading it, I'll just discuss it. My essay here on freedom and dictatorship. And Ayn Rand had asked a whole bunch of questions that she wanted to answer in her textbook of Americanism. Some she answered herself, and some, when Jonathan got the rights from Leonard Peikoff, he hired scholars to answer. And one of the questions that Ayn Rand asked is there any difference between communism and fascism? And I said, yes, there is. They are variations on a theme. They are two forms of collectivist political systems. So since I have this funny idea that we should define terms, we'll define what collectivism is. The collective just means group, right? You're looking at me like I just landed from Pluto. But yeah, it does. Collective means group. Doing things together as one. So collectivism means the primacy of the group over the individual. So collectivism, political theory claiming that an individual's life belongs not to the individual, but to the collective or the group. Whether the group is the race, which is the National Socialist version, the working class, which is the communist version, or some such thing. So collectivism utterly repudiates the moral principle of individual rights. So because of this, collectivism is a form of totalitarianism. And again, totalitarianism, one thing we could say for totalitarianism, the only positive thing, is the name is accurate, right? Total state. It's the total state. The state has total power, life and death power, over each individual citizen. It's funny, the timing here, because I've just recently, I'm a bookworm. Just recently I've been rereading George Orwell's 1984. And I read it a long time ago. And I'm not just rereading it now, and I'm impressed. Orwell really gets it right of what a totalitarian state is. And in addition to reading or rereading Ayn Rand's books, I strongly recommend everybody to, to read or reread 1984, what the total state looks like. No individual rights. The state's power over an individual is total life and death power, just as Hegel said. The state possesses the moral and the legal authority to dispose of an individual's life as it sees fit. It can kill you for whatever reason it wants. Maybe they don't agree with your religious views, or they don't agree with your political views, or your grandfather was revolutionary, or whatever. So, politically, the National Socialists, and fascism more broadly, so include the Italian variety. Notice the name, National Socialism. That's right, that's accurate. The National Socialists are nationalists who claim two things. One, their nation is superior, and it has the moral right to conquer, enslave, or exterminate the inferior peoples of other nations. And two, the nation, the state as a whole, has moral and legal supremacy over its own citizens whose lives belong to it. Deutschland über alles. Have you know any German?
Ambition.
What's that mean?
Deutschland means Germany over everything.
Yeah, Germany, yeah, right. Did you say, Jack?
Deutschland means German. I don't know what the über alles means.
Oh, Uber means over,
Germany
right?
overall.
Yeah,
Thank you.
right, yeah. Germany overall. And that has two aspects to its meaning, right? Because one, it means that Germany is the master race and has manifest destiny to conquer all of Europe, if not all of the world, and impose brutal rule of enslaving and or annihilating the inferior races. But also it means the German state over the German individual. Internationally, it means Germany's right to conquer the world, and domestically, it means the primacy of the German state over the German individual. By the way, this is why it's so. I think in Europe, you're from Europe, I take it.
No,
Oh, so you're American.
Ohio.
That's America, isn't it?
Last time I checked.
Yeah, I went to the government school, so my geography may be a little weak. But I was, in Europe, I think this is better known than in America. It's really shocking and inspiring in a way, and that is the story of the White Rose. You guys familiar with the White Rose? These were German kids, Aryans, the German says. So they were say medical students. So Hans Scholl, Sophie Scholl. They launched the resistance movement to the Nazis, 1942, 1943. They distributed leaflets. It was and in Munich, the belly of the beast, where National Socialism was birthed. It was most powerful. They were distributing leaflets. You can see what these leaflets say. Hitler's a lie. Everything that comes out of Hitler's mouth is a lie. National Socialism is evil. They're murdering Jews. They're murdering innocent civilians. These people are a disgrace to Germany. I mean, they had to know the way it would end, and it did. Eventually, they were caught by the Gestapo, and they were a sham trial. They weren't allowed to speak in their own defense, and they were executed. How did the Nazis execute them? They guillotined them. According to the story, with Hans Scholl, just as the blade was about to come down, Hans Scholl, who was like 21, long live freedom or something like that. And he cried out before they chopped off his head. These were kids, early 20s, late teens. They would have been safe if they kept their head down. They were Aryans, at least to the Nazis, whatever that meant. But these were real heroes. I mean, talk about courage above and beyond the call of duty, right in Nazi Germany, to stand up for freedom. They really inspire us. They show us people aren't all monsters. There are real heroes and heroines amongst us. So National Socialism, nationalism is a big part of this in both of the meanings. And notice that the National Socialist version was distinctively racist, as we know, the Aryan race. If you read Mein Kampf, Hitler's book, Hitler, it's interesting in Mein Kampf, Hitler does not claim physical superiority. He recognizes that other races are physical specimens, nor does he claim intellectual superiority. He recognizes that there are geniuses in other races. He claims moral superiority. Claims that several things. One, amongst the Aryans, is the most highly developed willingness for and the individual to sacrifice himself for the state, right? For the folk, right? For the people. So that self-sacrifice is most highly developed in the Germanic culture, in the Germanic peoples, he says. And Kant had emphasized this, and duty, do your duty, anti-egoism, anti-self-interest ethics that Kant articulated. Hegel, of course, developed that into a full-blown political theory. Do your duty to the state, your selfless service to the state. So Hitler claims the most highly cultivated form of self-sacrifice is in Aryan culture, and of course demonizes the Jews because he says the Jews are purely egoistic. There's no cultivated sense of self-sacrifice, and so on. But the second key point here is that the Nazis claim a biological basis to this moral superiority. We could dispute whether self-sacrifice is more highly developed in German culture or is it, and above all, we could dispute whether it's good or not, right? Even if it is highly developed in the German culture, we could dispute whether we could certainly challenge whether or not that's good. But the second point is, it's biologically rooted. It's in the blood and the bowels. We gotta love the imagery here. It's visceral. How do we know our moral superiority? It's just in our guts. We know it in our blood and our bowels. We just feel it. But it's biologically based. What a mess! What a mess is it? First of all, it contradicts everything we know about genetics. Moral characteristics are acquired characteristics. They can't be transmitted. Mom and dad might be moral paragons. Junior might be a criminal. Or vice versa. Mom and dad might be criminals. Junior might be a moral paragon. There's no biological basis for moral characteristics. There's no way for them to be genetically transmitted. So the Nazis had a simple solution to that problem. They rewrote the biology textbooks. Oh, it's good to be the king, right? They rewrote the biology textbooks to say that you could transmit biological moral characteristics biologically. That's one problem. But also, then, how do we know this? Since it contradicts the whole science of genetics, which by 1930s we knew something about. We just feel it. It's just a visceral feeling. It's just a sensation in our blood and our bowels. So it's completely subjective. It's a completely subjective epistemology. It's a completely subjective attempt to, there's no proof. We just feel it. The whole theory, what a mess. It's just astonishing, isn't it? Germany is such an advanced culture, and this like childlike theory, this ridiculous theory, becomes so popular in Germany. And it's truly a tragedy. Now, I want to point out, the claim of national superiority that all National Socialists claim, or all fascists claim, does not require racism. You could just claim national superiority as a culture. Our culture is superior to yours, and that makes us better than you, and we can conquer you and do whatever we want. The Nazis had a biological or racial basis to it. Okay, so the National Socialists are National Socialists. That's absolutely right. Now the Communists, on the other hand, are internationalists. They're international socialists. The Communists interpret history and current events not as a conflict amongst nations or races, but as a class struggle between the working class and the owning class. So the international working class must rise up in revolution and triumph over the oppressive international owning class. An example of the difference regarding World War II was the National Socialists viewed the world's fundamental political conflict as a national struggle between, in part, Germany and Britain. The Communists, on the other hand, interpreted it as an international struggle between, on one side, the German and British working classes, and on the other side, the German and British owning classes. So the warring factions for the communists, the warring factions on each side were composed of worldwide economic classes, the identities of which superseded nationality. Now you see why National Socialism, it's really interesting, isn't it? Because the communists claim, we're for the little guy, we're for the working man, we're for the oppressed, poor, downtrodden poor, and yet communism is Marxism, as mistaken as it is a philosophical theory. It takes it's an abstraction to think of an international working class and an international owning class. You can see what, it appeals to the intelligentsia, nobody else. The working class very rarely has any sympathy for once in a while, the working class very rarely has any sympathy for Marxism or communism. But fascism and National Socialism, that'll sometimes galvanize, the lower classes because it's a lot of it's racial. You can actually see at a perceptual level, you can observe who your enemies are, who the other tribe is, and it's easy to hate them. And National Socialism will sweep the gutters of any racist of any kind. The theory's at a very gut level, observational, perceptual level. You don't need to do much thinking. There's a different race, they're the enemy. Where's the international owning class? The British and German owning class are the enemies of the British and German workers. That doesn't compute for that's only the intellectuals, interested, taking a smit with that kind of theory. So now let's look at the economy. So one key point here is the National Socialists. They're both full socialists. Your life belongs to the state. We'll get into that a little more deeply. No individual rights. Your life belongs to the state. The state can kill you for any reason it wants. The National Socialists are National Socialists, and the Communists are International Socialists. Now, another distinction here between these two murderous ideologies is that the fascists or the National Socialists generally permit bankers, industrialists, businessmen, farmers, et al. To remain at their work, no longer as owners, but now as servants of the state. So individuals have no rights in any form, including the right to property. They obey the state, or they are replaced and most likely killed. In different terms, private property exists only nominally under fascism or National Socialism. The state fully dictates the use and disposal of all property. So in theory, by permitting experienced producers to remain at their work, fascism seeks to retain in the economy their productive ability. Hence the chilling line attributed to Hitler, quote, why need we trouble to socialize banks and factories? We socialize human beings, unquote. Now that line was attributed to Hitler by Hermann Rauschning in his book, The Voice of Destruction. Scholars today believe Rauschning lied about interviewing Hitler. They think he fabricated this. But even so, this captures the essence of what the National Socialists were all about. We nationalize people. We have Herr Schmidt, who's has 20 years of experience running a heavy truck factory, manufacturing trucks. We have Mrs. Schmidt and little Schmitz, in custody, and Herr Schmidt, you manufacture, you convert your factory from heavy trucks to tanks, right? And Herr Schmidt says, well, if you're right, I really don't want to manufacture tanks, and Chris, well, you want your married man, Herr Schmidt? You get the idea, So you have his expertise in manufacturing heavy trucks or tanks. We've nationalized people. So whether Hitler actually said that or not, Rauschning may well be lying about, but that's the essence of what the National Socialists did. So, now the communists, by contrast, nationalized banks and industries, fighting unremitting class war. They'll murder the owners as exploiters of the working class, seize the farms, the businesses, the factories. They'll place in charge party officials, non-productive party officials, men who are selected for these jobs based on one, party loyalty, and two, knowledge of Marxist, Leninist philosophy. They may not know the first thing about, you know, agriculture or banking or steel manufacturing or whatever. So what then happens, of course, is the agricultural and industrial production in the country plummets. You have party ideologues in charge of agriculture or steel manufacturing or banking or whatever it is, and they don't know the first thing about the business. And so living standards for the civilian population, for millions of innocent victims, drop to starvation levels. So National Socialism is actually more productive in that regard, in that they'll permit the former owners to continue to work in the field, and and they'll, under threat of their life or the lives of their families. Whereas the communists just kill off the owning class, kill off the people who have the knowledge of how to run the agricultural sector or the various businesses. So the National Socialists wage race war, the Communists wage class war. That's one way I distinguish the two. The National Socialists are race war socialists, the Communists are class war socialists. That's one way to distinguish the two. But the fundamental that unites these two hellish political systems is that in neither does an individual's life belong to him. In both, his life belongs to the state. What moral principle then constrains the totalitarian state in either form from disposing of an individual's life in any matter it deems necessary? None. So Rauschning again ascribes to Hitler perfectly the essence of what National Socialism was all about. He may be lying about the interview, but when he quotes Hitler, to quote, "There will be no license, no free space in which an individual belongs to himself. This is National Socialism," unquote. Rauschning may have lied about that, but he got it right about what the National Socialists actually stand for. Now, it may be even more chilling a presentation of what full socialism is comes from the Khmer Rouge, the Cambodian communists, who, under Pol Pot, in 3.5 years in the late 1970s, murdered 25% of the, maybe more, 25 to 30% of Cambodia's entire population. 25 to 30% of the country's entire population in 3.5 years. You don't see how, I realize how staggering that is. I mean, the numbers are numbing, I know, what these guys do. But, the Khmer Rouge, the Cambodian communists, their motto was, they said to their victims, "Losing you is no loss, keeping you is no specific gain." I mean, it's like you guys see the horror in you. Your life is nothing to us. It means nothing. If you, again, Ayn Rand, who grew up under the Soviets, her first novel, We the Living, some of you probably read it if you haven't, I strongly. Kira Ogrenova, the heroine, she says to Andrei Taganov, the communist, who's an honest guy as far as a KGB officer could be, NKVD, whatever it was back then. She says, I don't remember the exact quote, but she says, you have this life, and it's yours, and it's precious. And there's things that you love, there's things you care about, there's things you want to do with your life. And you see what the communists are saying. It doesn't mean squat to us. It doesn't mean a goddamn thing. You have no value. It's just children. You have no value. The only value you might have is in service to the state. There's no value of your life taken as an individual. I mean, it's just the evil here. It's just horrendous. So, because these two forms of collectivism, both National Socialism and communism, vehemently deny an individual's right even to his own life, it's eminently predictable that they devolved into history's bloodiest exterminators. So actually, I shouldn't use exterminators. That's what it's bloodiest annihilators of human life. The communists. If you read the Black Book of Communism, you guys familiar with that book? It's written by European Marxists, published by Harvard University Press. The good thing about the Black Book of look at it's 800 pages. Look at the subtitle: Crimes, Terror, Repression. Well, that tells us everything we But it's, the great thing about the Black Book of Communism is the authors were able to research in one of the secret police archives of, of Eastern and Central European communist states, including Bulgaria, where Dr. Dimitrova Clinton is from. And you read the story of the Državna Sigurnost, the Bulgarian KGB. They might even be even worse than the Soviets. But they researched into the actual files of Eastern European and Central European communist states, and to some degree into the Soviet archives as well, before the Soviet archives were shut down. So this is information straight from the horse's mouth. This comes right out of secret police archives in communist countries. By conservative estimate, the communists have murdered 100 million innocent civilians. And that's not even counting the people killed in the wars that the communists have started. If you read Rudolf Rommel, and I'm not sure, I don't know, I'm no expert on this, but I like Rommel. He died a few years ago. He was a libertarian. He was a political science professor at the University of Hawaii. He coined the term democide, murder of the people by various dictatorial regimes. And his book, Death by Government, which you can get from Amazon. This is not cheery reading, but it's important information. Professor Rommel goes through, as best he can, the statistics from all these different brutal dictatorships. He estimates that the communist murder count of innocent civilians is much higher than 100 million. The Black Book of Communism generally claims 20 million civilians murdered by the Soviets. Rommel estimates 60 million. Here's the thing about the Nazi Holocaust deniers. They're generally recognized as cranks. They're not generally taken it seriously intellectually. But the Soviet Holocaust deniers, there's a lot of them are tenured professors of history in American universities. And we're talking like leading universities, University of Chicago, Stanford, and you could what's her name? Sheila Fitzgerald is one. I think she was at the University of Chicago. Stalin wasn't such a bad guy. He's just it took some violence to to industrialize the backwoods agrarian country. 20 million people. They deny. No, maybe a few thousand people. The Stalin had to kill. They deny the Soviet, what I call the Soviet Holocaust, the Holodomor, the Ukrainian terror famine. Like Walter Duranty writing for the New York Times about this, they just deny. They deny it, and they have, and they teach their students as tenured professors of history at major American universities. I wrote an essay on this a few years ago, the Socialist Holocaust and its American deniers in the Objective Standard. But what year was that? It was 2013, I think. There's one of these Stalinists at Montclair State University in New Jersey, and there was a libertarian club there, and they brought me in to speak, tell the truth about communism. And so one of my closest friends is an Armenian guy, Arshak Benli, who grew up in Bulgaria, like Nora did. So I cajoled him to come with me, and we advertised. He's going to speak. What it was actually like, growing up under the communists in Bulgaria. And I was going to speak on the nature of communism. I was hoping that this English professor, who was a Stalinist, would show up, but he didn't. And I'm guessing because somebody was there speaking who actually lived under the communists, he probably didn't want to show up, but he didn't. But we told the truth about the communists. Anyway, this guy gets up in the Q&A. He's elderly. This was maybe 10 years ago. And he's in his, maybe, I don't know, let's say he's in his mid-70s. He's Dr. Bernstein. He says, I grew up in the Soviet Union. My family, Jewish family, he said, my family lost people to both the Nazis and to the communists. He said, I think that 20 million murder count is way too low. And I said, to the best of my knowledge, I think you're right. I think the Soviet murder count is much higher than that. And Mao in China may well be the worst worst mass murder in history, 70 or 80 million. Today is the suspected number for people that malmurdered in China. And you know what? It's interesting. And by the way, my daughter is adopted from China. My ex-wife and I adopted her when she was a baby. Mao might have, who knows? Mao might have killed off most of our family, for all I know. But anyhow, yeah, this is. There's no way to get exact numbers, but we know that the communists murdered probably well more than 100 million people. Here's an interesting tidbit. One distinction between the National Socialists and the communists. The National Socialists' favored method of mass murder was gas chambers. So that's horrible. I don't know what to think about it. It's horrifying. But the communists' favorite method of mass murder was deliberate man-made starvation. That. The Holodomor, of course, in Ukraine. You know why Ukrainians, you see why Ukrainians, are resisting Russian invasion so ferociously. They know what it's like to be under the thumb, of the Russians, and Putin's a former KGB guy, right? So, yeah, they haven't forgotten. In America, people don't know about the Ukrainian terror famine. We can credit the New York Times for that ignorance, right? They covered Walter Duranty, their Pulitzer Prize winning reporter, their man in Moscow, lied about it, right? He covered it up. And I think the New York Times still claims him as one of their Pulitzer Prize winners. But now also, deliberate man-made famine in China, murdered tens of millions of people. So I don't know what's worse. Maybe, I know we have some mothers here. Can you imagine being a Ukrainian mother? You guys know the rule of threes, right? We can survive 3 weeks without food, 3 days without water, and 3 minutes without air. Imagine being a Ukrainian mother. And all the food, Stalin is sent in the Red Army. He's taken all the food out of Ukraine. There's nothing to eat. Cordoned off the area with the troops. And you have 2 young children, let's say, and they say, Mommy, I'm hungry. He's going, oh my God. You're going to have to watch your children starve to death over a period of days or weeks. Makes you think that even the Nazis might have been more humane. 3 minutes in a gas chamber, I don't know. But anyway, that deliberate man-made famine, that's the communists' favorite method of mass murder. So there's a distinction. Okay. So, but so some of the numbers, according to Rommel, the communist murder count is close to 150 million. Black Book of Communism, 100 million. Mao himself is probably 70 or 80 million. Stalin, Lenin and Stalin close to 60 million. The National Socialists, 21 million is Rommel's best estimate. 5 to 6 million Jews in the Holocaust, of course, and then millions of Slavic peoples, right? Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, that the Nazis considered racial inferiors. Many other. Now the Nazis, the National Socialists, much less time, 1933 to 1945. But the communists had much more time. But anyway. All right, so that is the mass murder count. So, here's another question that Ayn Rand raised in the textbook of Americanism. Are dictatorships efficient? Right, it's a good question. And I answered, absolutely they're efficient at mass murder. Right? Conquest, well, I mean, this is accurate. Conquest, destruction, mass annihilation, these are the tasks at which dictatorships are efficient. So, I mentioned Rudolf Rommel, and his book, Death by Government, is grisly, but I think it's good source material. He devoted decades to researching this grisly topic. He coined the term democide, the murder of the people. Professor Rommel estimated that over 200 million innocent, legally disarmed civilians were murdered by their own governments during the 20th century war. Now that's broader than just the National Socialists and the Communists, but they're the main perpetrators. I mean, Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist regime in China, murdered millions, and then, the Turks, the Ottoman Empire, murdered at least 1 million Armenians during the Armenian genocide. There's a lot of brutes here in the world, but yeah, the communists and the National Socialists are the two main players here. So, mass murder is what these collectivist dictatorships are good at. So let me raise a further question here. Let's say one of these collectivist regimes, by some fantastic stretch of the imagination, let's say they did desire prosperity. How would they seek to attain it? How would they seek to create prosperity in their country? Now, if you've read Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged, she argues brilliantly that this, the rational mind, is the source of all values, of all wealth creation. For example, food has to be grown, which requires knowledge of agricultural science and agricultural technology, which requires the mind. Medicines have to be researched and developed, which requires knowledge of biology, biological science, which requires the mind. Buildings, have to be built. They require knowledge of architecture, engineering, mathematics, and so forth, which requires the mind. Every value that human life depends on is a product of the reasoning mind. Ayn Rand argues that brilliantly in Atlas Shrugged. And if you want a different source, Julius Simon, famous American economist, well, in fact, he was a professor at the University of Maryland, right? As well as University of Illinois. In 1980 or 81, published a terrific book, Ultimate Resource. And in it, Professor Simon argues that the ultimate resource is not, iron or coal or oil or fertile agricultural lands. The ultimate resource is this: human intelligence. So, I don't know if you ever read Atlas Shrugged, but he's certainly in the same philosophic arena here as Ayn Rand is. And Rand goes on in Atlas Shrugged to point out, well, you raise the question, brilliantly, and answer it brilliantly, and get a great novel with a real gripping story, mystery story. Does the mind, the creative mind, is capable of making advances in agriculture or medicine or any field, whatever, in the arts or in the sciences or whatever? Will the creative human mind function effectively under any type of social system, or does it require some specific political economic system? And I think to answer that question, we could take a few examples. So what would have happened to Charles Darwin, let's say, if he tried to publish Origin of Species under ISIS? I know, it's almost, yeah, they would have chopped off his head and burned the book. And similarly, the church during the Dark Ages, and probably the Puritans, as well. What would happen to Ayn Rand if she had stayed in the Soviet Union, and tried to, write and publish Atlas Shrugged, this brilliant novel glorifying individual rights? Well, she would have been dragged off to a gulag, Siberian gulag, slave labor camp with life expectancies measured in terms of months. What would have happened to Friedrich Hayek, the Nobel Prize winning economist, if he tried to return to Austria under the Nazis, under the National Socialists, and argued for free market capitalism and laissez-faire? Well, he would have been dragged off to Auschwitz, and they would have burned his books, and they would have killed him. So you see, under any type of statism, where the state is preeminent and the individual exists to serve the state, your life doesn't belong to you. Your life belongs to the state. And so, these innovative thinkers, if their ideas clash with the state, they're killed, and their books are burned, or and so on. Innovative thinkers require the principle of individual rights. It require political, economic freedom. It require capitalism. And the best historic example of this is late 19th and turn of the 20th century America. The post-13th Amendment in 1865 that ended slavery in this country, especially in the northern states, where there were no Jim Crow laws. In the South, because the Jim Crow laws brutally suppressed Black Americans. But in the North, the suppression was much less bad. And it's funny, even so, you see some of the great advances, turn of the 20th century America. Some of them, like at Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, where Booker T. Washington, ran a brilliant university, and Washington raised a lot of money from northern capitalists to open schools in the Jim Crow South for black children. But, George Washington Carver was a revolutionary in the field of agricultural science. This is in Alabama in the turn of the 20th century, even under the most brutal Jim Crow oppression. It's interesting that, there's degrees of evil. And as bad as the Jim Crow South was, it wasn't National Socialist Germany. It wasn't the Soviet Union. And drag Booker T. Washington and George Washington Carver and his teachers and students at Tuskegee off to the death camps. Degrees of evil. But anyhow, in the North, you look at the northern states of the United States, probably in the late 19th century, probably the freest period of human history. And you see this outpouring of invention, any field you want to mention, Thomas Edison and the electric lighting system, Alexander Graham Bell and telephone, the Wright brothers, and aviation. If Germany is the land of poets and philosophers, then the United States is the land of inventors and innovators. And it's not just confined to technology. Look at the humanities and the social sciences. William James pioneers the field of cognitive psychology at Harvard University in the 1880s. He opens the world's first research lab in psychology at Harvard. In 1890, publishes his massive, groundbreaking two-volume Principles of Psychology. Literature. The United States was a tiny country with a small population. Look at the national body of literature. Nathaniel Hawthorne, Edgar Allan Poe, Herman Melville, Walt Whitman, Mark Twain, Ralph Waldo Emerson. You can go on and on. Continue into the 20th century with Hemingway, Faulkner, Fitzgerald, and I would argue Ayn Rand, the Russian immigrant who's still underappreciated, that I think wrote the two greatest novels in world literature, Fountain and Atlas Shrugged, which is an assessment I will stand by till the day I die. So you see this outpouring of genius in any field you want to mention. The birth of the film industry, the birth of the mass publishing industry. Marconi is a European, invents radio, but he comes to America to commercialize it, and of course RCA becomes a forerunner of the birth of television in the United States, and so on and so forth. Now what? The Americans smarter than other people? No. Thinking of that line from Professor Randall, was Aristotle's scholar. Aristotle opens the metaphysics with his line, all men by nature desire to know. And Randall, who was a professor at Columbia, said, if Aristotle had the occasion to teach at an American university, he might have changed his mind. So, no, the Americans aren't smarter than anybody else. But the freedom, the principle of individual rights that was still so operative in the culture in the late 19th and turn of the 20th centuries, liberated the best amongst the human race, those who choose to think. The creative minds are liberated to make advances in any field, in any and every field that you can imagine. So here's the principle. If your life belongs to you, which is the essence of individual rights, if your life belongs to you, it follows logically that your mind belongs to you. And you are free to think and broadcast your thinking as you will. Guide your life by your own judgment, as long as you don't initiate force or fraud against innocent victims. As Ayn Rand put it very exactly, you govern your life by your own thinking. On the other hand, if your life belongs to the state, which is the essence of National Socialism and communism, any form of full socialism, if your life belongs to the state, then the only thinking you can do is that which is permitted by the state. And if you clash with the state, if your thinking contradicts the state, then you are in big trouble. You are going to be incarcerated, tortured, exiled if you're lucky, executed, and so on and so forth. But you are not allowed to disagree with the state. So this is why we see the free societies make all these advances and have such great higher levels of prosperity, because they liberate mankind's survivalism, as Ayn Rand calls it, the rational mind. So, the great minds, we'll wrap this up in just a couple of minutes, we go to Q&A. The great minds that create intellectual and material wealth are independent thinkers. They follow their own judgment, not a dictator's arbitrary decree. Often they conceive of ideas or identify truths previously undreamed of were considered socially unacceptable. For example, Copernicus, Darwin, Pasteur. So for the National Socialists and the Communists, it raised the question, must these great thinkers, take some examples, must the Edisons, the Carnegies, the Shakespeares, the Beethovens, must they truckle before Stalin to receive permission to create? What if the dictator, who's an ideologue and a power luster after all, not a creative thinker, what if the dictator discerns no merit in the proposal? Will it then be quashed? Would the proud individual and independent minds capable of creative achievements be willing to lick the boots of a tyrant? I'm thinking of Cyrano here. You know, Cyrano going to be willing to lick the boots of the tyrant so that he may write poems? Will they kowtow before authority in order that they might be granted the privilege to think? Related, will such thinkers as great thinkers as these, even if granted state approval to create, will they turn off their minds with the laboratory lights when their countrymen are brutally enslaved? Will they question only nature seeking its laws, or will they also question the dictator seeking justice? And minds capable of splitting the atom, of revolutionizing the steel industry, of inventing electric light, of writing Macbeth, of composing Beethoven's Ninth, they're also capable of challenging the moral rectitude of the dictator's regime, of raising their voice, of being heard, and of having something to say. What happens then? Well, what happened to Socrates? What happened to Thomas More? What happened to Giordano Bruno and Galileo? What happened to Andrei Sakharov? Nothing good, in case you don't know. They were exiled or tortured or killed by the oppressive regime. Power lusters have always known their primordial enemy, the fearlessly independent mind. And they do everything in their power to crush it, to crush the single human attribute necessary to create intellectual material wealth and thereby to sustain human life. This is why dictatorships, preeminently the 20th century and 21st century collectivist regimes, the National Socialists and Communists, this is why dictatorships efficiently wreak mass annihilation, but never remotely approximate capitalism's efficient production of intellectual and material wealth. Thank you. Yes, thank you. Sorry to be so grim, but that's the topic, right?
Thank you so much. This was absolutely fascinating. Do we have any questions on the chat?
Any from Iceland?
No.
And we would like to open the floor for questions, and then we can do some book signing. Does anybody have a question? Yes?
Yeah, you pointed out similarities between the political and economic system in Sweden and that of the United States. Do you see any significant differences between the two systems?
All right, so Dr. Leonard Peikoff trained me to always repeat the question. I think you guys heard it, but I'm like so trained to do that. Thank you. The question was, I pointed out similarities between the Scandinavian mixed economies and the American mixed economies. Do I see any significant differences? I think that's a good question. I haven't really thought about that at great length, so I'm just thinking out loud here. I think the work ethic amongst the American people, and until maybe the pandemic, a lot of people seem to not want to work anymore. But up until that time, I think the work ethic of the American people was generally higher than in most European countries, including in Sweden and in the Scandinavian countries. I think that's generally true. I think the U.S. government traditionally probably, placed, maybe until Obama. Remember Obama with you didn't create that. The real semi-socialist mentality. I think that's 21st century in America. Whereas I think in European countries, the government probably has, more drastically criticized the entrepreneurship and capitalism and, you know, push the collectivist idea that takes a village, that you didn't create that, that society as a whole created that. I think the American ethos and the American government until the last 20 years or so has supported entrepreneurship more than in Sweden and in Scandinavia or in Europe. But it's interesting though, because you have these European businessmen who are enormously wealthy. I forget the name. Who's the guy who founded IKEA and built it up? And what's his
You
name?
have
Do you
to
know?
get the name.
Yeah. And unfortunately, he had some connection with the Nazis when he was young, as I recall. But he repudiated. He was very young during the war, and he repudiated that and went on to be, you know, a big-time business success. But I don't know if he's. I mean, you know, in the United States, you got people like Steve Jobs and, you know, and Sam Walton, you know, and people like that I think, you know, widely admired as rising up out of poverty to become billionaires. And Andrew Carnegie back in the day, I think were probably more widely admired by the American people than these real successful entrepreneurs are in Europe, and probably not as criticized by the government, U.S. government until recently as they have been in Europe. I think, I'm not, you know.
If I could add something, from what I've read, obviously income tax in Scandinavian countries is way higher, like prohibitively higher, so that's a big difference.
Yeah, right, good point.
However, I heard and I've read that corporate tax is relatively low, so this is what allows businesses to prosper. And two interesting pieces of trivia. One is in 2015, the Prime Minister of Denmark visited Harvard and gave a lecture. And a lot of students asked him about socialism, and they were very positively, almost enamored of socialism, and asked him about Denmark and Scandinavian countries and about their socialist economy. So he said, let me get one thing straight. Denmark is a free market economy. While it's true that it needs capitalism to generate any profit, because otherwise we know very well what happens. Communism and poverty and misery happens. It's almost like a parasitical construction where imagine you have this strong oak tree and then you have some ivy or other parasitical plant feeding off of it. So this is how a lot of these European countries function. They absolutely need free market economy to generate anything, but they've allowed various parasitical structures that get bigger and more powerful every day, and unfortunately I see this happening to a certain extent in the United States.
The free on-demand medical care, of course, is prohibitively expensive, bankrupts the system.
You know what I would add to that? There seems to be a greater commitment to individuality here in the United States, and that contributes to the entrepreneurship of the free market. Whereas in European countries, and especially Scandinavia, there's a greater willingness to go along and be socialized. They willingly, by law, you know, give 50–60% of their salary to taxes. That's by vote. They willingly do that. They're willing to subsume themselves into the society to a much greater extent than we are.
Yeah, I wouldn't voluntarily do that.
But even so, there are a lot of people who, in Scandinavian countries, who really oppose that, so they have various conservative movements. And actually the famous writer, children's author Astrid Lindgren, who wrote Pippi Longstocking, she was a favorite author of mine, Carlson, and other books. She was in favor of giving quite a lot, and because she was very famous, she made a lot of money. And at some point, because of some weird provision in Swedish tax legislation, it turned out that she had to pay 80% of income tax plus whatever she earned as a freelancer. So actually, by law, she would have had paid more than 100%, which is of course impossible. So even this socialist-minded person, she had enough of it, and she published a pamphlet in the major Stockholm newspaper, and they actually changed the law thanks to that.
Well, you know, if men can have babies, why can't we pay 100%, more than 100% of our income?
Yeah.
Thanks so much for doing this. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how the land of poets and philosophers, for one, having such terrible, dangerous philosophy coming out, how did the, architecture to zoology not get infected? How did it not seem to fully seep in? And to the extent that it did reach the population that was educated and did seem to have a good head start relative to other places in the world, how are they so susceptible to that?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Yeah. Land of poets and philosophers, how, since I said Germany is one of the most advanced cultures in history, how were they able to do that under this kind of philosophy? And then two, given Germany was so advanced, how are they susceptible to this primitive and barbaric philosophy? Yeah, that's a really good question. First of all, a lot of German advances were prior to the 20th century. You look at the field of music. And maybe the rising collectivism, stifled, because if we consider Germany and Austria as a very similar culture, Mozart, and Beethoven, and Brahms, and Bach, there's all this beautiful music. There hasn't been any great composer and Mendelssohn, who was a German Jew. There haven't been anybody at that level in a long time. In literature, I mentioned Goethe and Schiller and Heinrich Heine. There's any number of brilliant German writers. We consider Goethe the German Shakespeare. The Germans consider Shakespeare the English Goethe. But a lot of this was done prior to the early 20th century, when National Socialists take over a very advanced civilization that had made enormous progress in the sciences and in technology and in industry. And then they, in 12 years, what Germany looked like in 1945. It was just rubble. Germany was devastated. By the end of World War II, they brought devastation on the country. Millions and millions and millions of German civilians were dead. But since then, since the end of the war, West Germany being a very free country, and a free market, and since the late 20th century, East Germany, becomes Germany, and it's a very mixed case, but it's still a relatively free country. One of the things that's interesting, when you have a culture that stresses education, and Germany does. When you have a culture that stresses education, even a little bit of freedom, and you're going to see people develop their minds and make progress in all kinds of fields, and the Germans have. I don't want to sound like By the way, where on the continent, this was so ironic about the brutal anti-Semitism of National Socialism. Which country on the continent was the one that respected the rights of Jews to leave the ghettos and become mainstream in the culture? It was Germany, right? It was Germany. Moses Mendelssohn, and who was the grandfather of Felix Mendelssohn, who was a philosophy professor. And by the way, it was Moses Mendelssohn was the one who called Kant the Old Destroyer. But German Christians in the 18th century during the Enlightenment very often recognized, the rights of the Jews to leave the ghetto and get educated. And you see German Jews assimilated into mainstream German culture. Teachers, professors, writers, intermarrying with German Catholics and Protestants. That's why if you said the turn of the 20th century, there's going to be this phenomenon that's going to rise on the European continent in a few decades called National Socialism. It's going to be brutally anti-Semitic. They're going to murder millions of Jews. You would guess Poland, Ukraine, Russia. That's where the pogroms took place. You would never guess Germany. Germany would literally have been the last place. Because, by the way, a story that Einstein told. His German culture at its best. All these scientists would get together, have a dinner in Berlin or wherever. And some were Jews, and some were Catholics, and some were Protestants, whatever. And Germany being this very musical culture, they were musicians, they brought their instruments, and at dinner they discussed physics and all these scientific questions, and after dinner they had their schnapps or whatever, and they got out their violins and they played all this beautiful music, like Mozart and Beethoven and everything. And this German culture at its best. German culture at its worst, of course, is Auschwitz, but it's a big difference.
I would recommend another source for you, maybe. Do you all know who Matthias Desmet is? Matthias, D-E-S-M-E-T. He's a Belgian.
Did he
Uh,
write about mass formation?
Exactly.
Yeah.
He's a clinical psychologist, and he's the one who popularized the term, the psychology of or that's the book, Psychology of Totalitarianism, popularized the term mass formation or mass formation psychosis to explain how a society of people like Germans or anybody can fall, under the thrall of something like a totalitarian ideology, and like arguably perhaps we did, the whole world did, in the last couple of years, but his book.
Yeah, look what happened in Australia.
Yeah.
It's
I mean,
just
yes,
astonishing,
yeah.
and we're not that far behind.
Yeah.
Check.
I'm not sure that I heard you correctly, but it seemed to me that you were talking about the Chinese leader Chiang Kai-shek.
Yeah.
Well, wasn't it actually Mao Zedong?
It was both.
Well, Mao was the most egregious mass murderer. According to Rommel's book, Chiang Kai-shek murdered several millions.
Oh, because he's the one that fled to Taiwan.
Yeah, well, yeah, he's the lesser of two evils, without a doubt. Without a doubt. But,
Okay.
yeah, like Mao, I forget, we get Rummel's book, Death by Government, I forget the murder count attributed to the nationalists, but it was several million. But to the communists, it's like tens of millions.
Yeah.
Yes, Zach,
Oh,
we
yeah.
got a big Zach attack here.
Okay. So a lot of college students these days will tell you that we should try communism in America. And they say the reason we should try and when you tell them, well, look at how communism worked out in Russia and China, they say, well, that was not real communism. Real communism involves no government and everyone has their rights and everything. So how would you respond to these college students?
All right, wait, Zach is pointing out that there's a lot of college students believe that the United States should move towards communism or should become communist, and if you argue, well, look what communism did in Russia and China and these other countries, they argue, they respond, that's not real communism. Real communism is anarchy, no government, right? Yeah, well, Marx was an anarchist at the end of the day. I mean, but it was only after the dictatorship, liquidated the owning class and brainwashed everybody to be a communist. First of all, if you want to move towards anarchy, which literally means no government, how many Americans are going to, under anarchy, how many Americans are going to choose to live communally? I don't know that there's going to be, that there's going to be that many. But anarchy has a whole set of problems. If we're gonna, one of the things I'm thinking of, Zach, when you talk about that is defund the police. Let's defund the police. We'll have anarchy. Rashida Tlaib, Detroit is part of her jurisdiction. She wanted to eliminate the police altogether, replace them with social workers. Now, the crime rate, what is this? That's criminals live. The gangbangers in the hood, any criminals, but I love the terminology anyway, in the projects, the little gun busters. Little gun busters are not going to stop dealing drugs, shooting other drug gangs, killing anybody who gets in their way, including civilians get caught in the crossfire. So anarchy is going to come with, we eliminate the state, then we eliminate along with it the police presence, criminal justice system, amongst other things. The crime rate, this is criminals live. So the crime rate's going to go way up. Anarchy is going to have a real cost factor. And I don't know that it's going to lead to communism. Most people don't want to live communally. Why do you think Stalin, this is in Ukraine, which doesn't have the individualistic heritage that the United States has. Why do you think Stalin deliberately starved millions of Ukrainian civilians? One of the leading reasons was they did not want to leave the peasants did not want to leave their own small plots of land to work on the collective farm. They don't want to live communally, even in Ukraine. I don't think it's going to go over too well with the United States. there's gonna be a major cause factor of having anarchy. Yeah, go ahead.
So then, what is real communism then? What definition of Marx? It's like no government, right?
Marx says that that's the end game, but you have to first turn people into communists. People are too individualistic for Marx. They want their own land. They want their own, just like, kids growing up, they want their own room. Peasants want their own land. So many people want their own home. They want to live independently. They want to live as individuals, not as cogs in the machine. So you got to go through decades, or however long it takes, of the dictatorship of the proletariat, where one, you eliminate the owning class who are incorrigible, meaning you liquidate them, you kill them, and then you brainwash. Capitalism brainwashes the kids growing up to be egoists and individualists, to want to live their own lives and pursue happiness. And communism will brainwash the kids growing up to be little mini collectivists that sacrifice themselves for the state. So you need decades of retraining before you get to the point where everybody is a communalist, is willing to live, share alike, and not live individualistically. That takes decades of social engineering and social training and the murder of many recalcitrant individuals before you can get. And even then, that's his theory. But even then, what do you do with the people who are independent thinkers? They don't accept the brainwashing. They find some old history book and, oh man, back in the day, people that had individual rights, they had a right to their own life. They didn't have to serve the state. They weren't killed by the government if they refused to serve the state. What are you going to do with these individuals? Well, the communists are going to kill them. That's what they're going to do.
And what I'd like to add on to that is that once you eliminate the landowners and everything, and then now you say, okay, now we are going to Marx's final stage of the plan, which is to eliminate our own government and live in a sort of a communal anarchy. What usually happens, well, what always happens is human nature has it that the dictator currently in power doesn't want to give up his power. So that's why
It's very
communism, like, it looks good on paper, but it will never actually work.
You know what? It's like a business. It's like business deal. Offer and counter offer. I would say to those people, I got a counter offer. How about we respect the principle of individual rights, we uphold the principle of individual rights, we respect the right of every individual to live their life as in accordance with their own best judgment, as long as they do not initiate force or fraud. We establish a government whose moral purpose is to protect individual rights. We celebrate the mind. How about we create a culture of reason where we celebrate the mind and a politics of individual rights, and then stand back and watch the torrent of outpouring of creations, innovations, and inventions in every field, from A to Z, from agriculture to zoology, and then everything in between. There's my counter offer.
There were other questions?
Yeah, I'm wondering how you think Hegel might have reacted if he had been alive in, say, the 1930s and 1940s to the German state.
How do I think Hegel would have reacted?
Would he have been happy with the state?
Yeah, would Hegel have been happy with the Nazi, with the National Socialist state, or the Communist state for that matter? There's obviously there's no way to know the answer. What's the it's a counterfactual. There's a fallacy in logic. I forget the name of it. But when you try and deduce conclusions from fantasy or from fiction or from things that weren't real or never existed. So all we can do is speculate. We certainly can speculate. This is the fallacy of, I forget the name of it, but the essence of it is to try to deduce from fantasy premises or things that didn't happen. And one of the fun things about that, you see as a game, you see people, there's games. What if Nazi Germany had won World War II? And then there's, you have this whole games that you play that can be really interesting and engaging. Hegel, I'm just thinking out loud here. Hegel was an intellectual, obviously. He was a philosophy professor and a writer. You know, you never know. He had this horrendous philosophy that your life belongs to the state, but he was also an intellectual. If he was confronted with the death camps and, you know, all these people, these horrendous, you know, mass murders by the not National Socialists and Communists, he might have recoiled from that. I didn't mean that. But then on the other hand, maybe he did. I don't
It
know.
seemed to be a refutation of his philosophy.
Yeah.
But when we who grew up in Bulgaria and other communist countries, we had to study Marxism, and the textbook theory was that Marx took Hegel's dialectic and philosophy and turned it upside down. So Hegel,
That's right.
for all his flaws and statism, was an idealist, while Marx was materialist. So I would think that Hegel would have had some moral absolute, which is something that the communists never had. Both Marx and Lenin say whatever serves our needs at this particular moment, that's what's right and good, and we can change it. So that is in essence what totalitarian regimes do.
Yeah, but see, Hegel, you're right. But Hegel thought the moral absolute was that which promotes the state.
Yeah.
And so if you could convince him,
I disagree with that, but at least he was idealist.
yeah, he was. But if you could convince him that the annihilation of the Jews or the inferior races served the German state, or the annihilation of the owning class, you know, served the workers' paradise, then, you know, he might have at the very least tolerated it. But you know what comes to mind, Dr. Clinton, is Gorbachev. Because, you know, he was a hardcore communist, right? And yet at some point, the bloodshed, the tyranny, the horrors of it, even to a hardcore communist like Gorbachev, that didn't work, obviously. It's like, enough. And he started, you know, the liberalization of the Soviet regime with glasnost and perestroika. I wonder if Hegel had seen the horrors, obviously I have no way of knowing, but I wonder if he would have, you know, reacted in a way similar to the way Gorbachev reacted. Enough of this. Yeah.
People higher ups in these political systems like National Socialism and Communism, do they just plain get their jollies on seeing people oppressed and killed?
Yeah.
Is that what drives them?
Could be. Yeah, did he question these higher ups and under National Socialism and communism, do they just find some kind of sick, perverse pleasure in murdering men? I think in some cases that's true. There's a concept of nihilism, you know, of destruction for its own sake. I gave you a true story. So in 1945, as you know, Germany's enemies closed in on Germany from both east and west, they needed trains desperately to ship men and supplies to the front, both the Western Front, where the Americans and the British were advancing, and the Eastern Front, where the Russians were advancing. In a number of cases, they took those trains, and instead of using them to ship men and supplies, they used them to ship Jews to the death camps. So, you know, it hastened their own demise. But, you know, that nihilistic bloodlust, that desire to kill, you know, the people you hate is dominated. It reminds me of the parable of the scorpion and the frog. You know, the scorpion wants to cross the river. He says, he tries to cajole the frog to give him a ride. The frog, I'm giving you a ride. You'll halfway across, you'll sting me and I'll die. You know, and the scorpion says, I won't sting you. If I sting you and you die, then I'm going to die. And so the frog is convinced that, you know, it's not in the scorpion's rational self-interest to kill the frog. So, you know, he's got this naive view that people act, or, you know, it's fable, that people act in their rational self-interest. So he says, okay. And he carries him halfway across the river, and the scorpion stings him. And as the frog sinks beneath the waves and he's dying, so why'd you do that? Now you'll die also. And the scorpion says, it's what I do. You know, it's what I am. And that's, I think, captures who's attracted to life and death power over a country is the sickest, most vicious people. So yeah, I think to some extent, yeah. And I think that true example of the Nazis hastening their own demise in order to murder more and more of the people that they hated I think think the answer to your question to some degree is yes. It's some kind of sick, perverse, it's not really pleasure, but some version of, you know, for a mass murderer of pleasure. So some pale facsimile of it.
If I may add, I think that obviously human nature has good and bad in it, but it's flawed. So certain regimes, certain systems like the American system, well, of course, it's not perfect and it not be, gives opportunity for the best in human nature to be shown. And if people really want to work hard, you know, they can achieve a lot of things. But both communism and National Socialism, they're just fertile grounds for the worst in human nature. And usually people who are occupying high government positions, that I'm not sure if they were mentally sick, but one thing that the communists did, for example, they did in Bulgaria, they immediately freed the jails and released all murderers and psychopaths, and they became members of government. So people who would want to be guards, people who would want to be you know, in charge of killing people, they're not normal people. So these systems actually provide really fertile ground. They really stimulate that.
Yeah, I remember I was a kid in the 1960s, the height of the Cold War. I can remember when the Berlin Wall went up in 1961, never mind when it came down. But you know, the supporters of the Soviet Union, you know, I grew up in Brooklyn, which is like, you know, almost like growing up in Moscow. But you know, the supporters of the Soviet Union said there's no crime in the Soviet Union, and no street crime. There's no street crime in the Soviet Union. And it wasn't until years later that I realized, well, yeah, that's because all the criminals are in the government, you know, and they have the power of the state with which to murder, you know, millions of people. Yeah, notice you don't get George Washington as head of state, you know, in the Soviet Union or in Nazi Germany. And you don't get Joseph Stalin or Adolf Hitler, you know, as president of the United States in 1790, you know, 1790. The different philosophies and the different cultures lead to different political systems and different political leaders.
Zach, you had one more question, I think?
Oh, it was not a question. I was just trying to comment to add on to what he said. It's that, well, if we look like, let's say Hitler, for example, right? When he was a little kid, he did have some nationalist elements to his mindset, and he believed in pan-Germanism, but he definitely had no hate of Jews. You can read his Mein Kampf autobiography to find out. He only really got radicalized after he signed up as a fighter for Germany in World War I. And after that, increasingly more and more, in his book, he said he observed Jewish people until the point where he could identify them just by looking at their physical characteristics and the actions that they do. And by that, he singled them out as a very morally corrupt, most lowly race in human society. So basically what I'm saying is, it's not like these people are like, these people aren't sort of psychopaths. They're mentally ill. But that doesn't mean that they were born mentally ill. So and the scary thing about it is that all of us in this room have a potential, have a small potential, because of human sin, to become like one of those psychopaths. Very small potential, but there is a potential. And the reason is because if put in the right conditions, with the right amount of trauma, with the right amount of radicalization and like propaganda and brainwashing, anyone in this room can become radicalized.
Well, I mean, the claim is that anybody in this room can become, you know, under the right amount of propaganda or, you know, whatever it is, can become a Nazi or a National Socialist or a communist. You know, I can see making that claim about babies, you know, about children, you know, adults who might have formed political principles, you know, in support of individual rights and freedom. I don't know that there's anything the communists or Nazis could do that would make me into a communist or Nazi. They could kill me, and they would. But turn me into one of them.
Let me reword it. Maybe not us in the room, but like
No,
Like,
but
if you
an
brainwash the
adult,
kid from
but by the time
baby.
you're adult, you might have already formed a philosophy that's completely contradictory to what the National Socialists and the Communists, have, believe in, and you're committed to it, and you fight them to the death, and they have to kill you.
Mhm.
They have to kill you, because they can't convert you.
Yeah. So what I'm just trying to say is it's pretty scary to think about Hitler used to be a normal human being at some point.
It is, think of little Hitler, yeah, I mean, it is, I mean, they were children at one point, Joseph Stalin, Mao. By the way, you read some of his biographies, I forget who wrote that biography of Mao, it's definitive, you see, he was thuggish, not surprisingly, from an early age, an anti-intellectual thug. Yeah, I mean, in a clinical way, what you're saying, Zach's fascinating. I mean, look at the childhood of, of little Joseph Stalin, or little Adolf Hitler, or little Mao Zedong, and this little Pol Pot. These guys grew up to be just the most murderous creatures. What were they like as little kids? As teenagers. Their first girlfriend when he was 16 or 17. What was he like with his first girlfriend? I was like, yeah, it's kind of, you look horrified. It's like these serial killers. Very often we know as children they tortured to death animals, right? And they started with animals, and they were. So what were these guys like when they were little kids? I mean, I don't have a strong enough stomach to plumb the depths of this, but I can see why some people might be fascinated by the question. Yeah.
But we do have freedom of choice, and we are responsible for our moral choices, so I think that
Yeah.
definitely not everyone could evolve into such human beings, and of course certain systems facilitate that.
Yeah. I mean, I mentioned the White Rose before. These were German kids. They were kids. Teenagers, early 20s. They were Aryans. All they had to do was keep their head down and their mouths shut. They were safe from the Nazis, and they stood up, knowing that death in the most. There was no way to survive the war. They knew at some point they'd be caught. And they did it anyway. That's real courage above and beyond the code. They were not going to be converted to National Socialism, no matter what was done to them.
We can continue the discussion, and maybe Dr. Bernstein would like to sign some books, so.
Yeah, if you guys want to buy
Feel free to look at
this
the
one,
copy.
education book, you got to get it from Amazon right now. We're going to do an education seminar in a few months, right? On this book.
Yes,
If you want
yes,
that, okay.
yes.
But right now, we have a dearth of Eagles. We don't have a dearth of copies, so if anybody wants to. What do we sell these for, $10?
Yes, yeah, that's actually 50% discount.
So anybody who wants, and you guys know you want copies, you know you do. So this is going to go to the Botev, the proceeds go to the Botev Academy and to the American Research Center of Bulgaria.
Here's my money, sir.
All right, thank you.
Do
Get
you
it?
have a pen? I can give the pen.
Yeah, no pen.
Okay.
So who's making that?
Matt.
Matt. Matt. Nora's getting that.
Neither do Stan.
Summer 2002, I remember. That's when they did both an East Coast and a West Coast conference, right? Now you,
I think so,
yeah, I remember that.
because in 2001, we had 9/11.
Oh, yeah. What year was David born?
87.
So he was 14.
Veli ste u Bulgariji, ne?
15, no, 15.
Where?
Oh,
Yeah,
tam
No,
treba biti.
that West Coast conference was in Stanford. And I got there, and David was, with so 15-year-old David was at the front desk, and he's wearing my name. He's wearing the Andrew Bernstein. Yeah, he's wearing the Andrew Bernstein tag, and somebody said to him, "Oh, Dr. Bernstein, I didn't realize you were so young."
So,
Yeah, I remember that. Can we get a pen?
Keep putting comments.
Yeah. Well, David was always a fun.
Signing up for ones that I collect.
Yeah, like crazy.
Is that a son, grandson?
Thank you. I've been back so many times. I have so many friends there.
I was gonna tell you a story.
What?
I very expensive.
I don't know if I'll go to Sofia this time, though. We might, very often, we'll go to Sofia, and then we hop in the car and we go down to Greece.
So this is our research center. We basically take the contact between American and Bulgarian students and promote American values.
Where is it? In Sofia.
The Chilimeter area, which is probably 5 minutes by public transport
got a
from
pen?
the university and the national.
Pen? How about a pen?
I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
And this is for you.
Okay, thank you.
Susan says we already spoke.
Can you help unpack the books?
Okay.
At the embassy.
Okay, so this is the map.
Yeah. And then back so many times after because I made so many friends. And I love the place.
So what about the Tarzan movie?
Yes, I love the food, I love the music. I've been all over the country. Learned to ski in Borovitz and Bansko. Learned to ride horses with my daughter. We took horseback riding lessons at a stable near
At the
Sofia.
end,
No,
at the end,
from the
Thank you, appreciate it.
film, okay?
the
Just
other movie,
Just, I mean, yeah, just been all over the place.
Berlin is talking to them.
Yeah, the food is great. I love, you know, the sort of the Mediterranean. It's kind of Mediterranean, really. It's really great salads and grilled meat
And so these two guys
and
are
wonderful
saying,
bread
"That's
and the
not
wines. Okay? All the wines. Yeah. Cerveno, how does it go? Cerveno vino, Bialo.
Right at the end of the movie, at a movie end.
That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah. Visit our research center. We also help organize trips and just organize events like that both
Well,
here and in
what you
Bulgaria.
Is the Christy Botev Center in the school?
So,
But
the Christy
we have plenty of books, we
Academy is
don't have
a very good Bulgarian school, and they're using this building on
Well,
Sundays,
go
so they
draw
have
some
Oh, just
Bulgarian
Sunday, but they have another place
I think that this is their main location.
in this school.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
So, because it's Sunday school for heritage speakers, because we were busy during the week,
Yeah.
but it's great that it often has events, there's this auditorium, they teach
Yeah, yeah,
Bulgarian
no, it's
to
very nice.
people, yeah, all
Kenny's
ages.
Yeah,
junior
yeah,
and
yeah.
soon Albany. So,
Yeah, they carry out
yes, he
over
graduates from college and then.
Okay, okay. Because when I drove, my GPS took me here, but then I'm looking and I'm saying, there's no sign that says Christo Botev, it says the school.
Yeah. No, she's
So I couldn't figure out where I was.
But actually, it's about his GPS system now, so you for his Bottom Academy, it's
I put in the address, I typed it, you know, whatever is Carroll Drive or whatever.
Come on, guys. Pony up. We gotta sell some
Anyway,
books.
yes, I love everything Bulgarian.
Yeah.
That's one of the only things I have.
How much for the floor model of your other book? That you got?
Oh, you want it?
The price is right.
Well, you can get this from Amazon for like $16, so this is the only copy I have with me. So yeah.
I just need to wait for shipping.
So this is the only copy. But like Nora said, we're gonna be doing this,
And here also.
yeah, well, I don't know what the venue would be, but it's somewhere around here.
That's it.